I'm Pete Betke of George Mason University. I'm the economics faculty and also the director of the FA Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And so I'd like to welcome you here for this book panel today. We're here to discuss and learn more about consumer credit in the American economy. New book out by Todd Zywicki and co-authors. The way that I want to read something to you, though. So Todd and I used to teach a class in the law school here called The Rule of Law and Economic Development. And when we taught that class, one of the things that we focused on is, remember what the effect of the rule of law is on economic development. And there's a book by an economist named Reuben Brenner called The Labyrinth of Prosperity. And one of the things that's fascinating about it is Brennan summarizes why some nations are rich and other nations are poor under the following way. The nations that are rich are those that allow people to bet on ideas and find the financing to bring those bets to life. And the countries that are poor are the ones that discourage people betting on ideas or block their ability to get financing to bring it to life. And so one of the lifebloods of an economy is, in fact, financial intermediation and the role that that plays, how the savings of some become investment funds for other. And one of the real strong points of this book is how it is that that investment decision is also your consumer decision, right? Because what you're doing as a consumer is also investing in your stream of activities over time. So one of the real powerful ideas in that, and what are the consequences when, for a variety of reasons, we end up by chokeholding our ability to find those financing even in our own personal decisions. But I don't take it from me. I want to point out one of the highlights or blurbs in the back of the book, which is from Vernon Smith. If you think the development, history, and behavioral aspects of consumer credit are not exciting, read this comprehensive treatise on the topic as an emergent order of behavioral and parallel institutional rules, with no commanding identifiable leader. Particularly informative and original is the author's examination of the cognitive biases, experimental, and behavioral literature. I want to, sort of reinforce that idea from Todd. So, very important book. Hopefully, we'll have a very good discussion today. The way it will go today is that we're going to have Todd come up first, and then we have two very distinguished commentators, Josh Wright and Stephen Pearlstein. So, what I'm going to do is in a second here, I'm going to do all the introductions now, and then they'll just come on up and give their talks. Once they're done with that, then we'll open it up for Q&A. From everyone else. So let me just read these introductions to everyone. Todd Zywicki is a senior fellow with the FA Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, and a senior scholar of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He is also the foundation professor of law at George Mason University School of Law. He specializes in bankruptcy, contracts, commercial law, business associations, law and economics, public choice, and the law. Professor Zywicki has testified before Congress on consumer bankruptcy and consumer credit. He's frequently wrestled with Elizabeth Warren. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that today. He's published, besides in academic journals, he's published on the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Forbes, etc. Josh Wright is currently commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission. Wright was previously a professor at George Mason University School of Law and held a courtesy appointment in the Department of Economics. Wright is a leading scholar in antitrust law, economics, consumer protection, and has published more than 60 articles in journals and in book chapters, and co-authored a leading case book and edited several book volumes focusing on these issues. Professor Stephen Pearlstein is Robinson Professor of Public and International Affairs at George Mason University, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning business and economic columnist for the Washington Post. Professor Pearlstein was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2008 for the columns the previous year, anticipating and explaining the financial crisis and global economic downturn. In 2011, he won the Gerald Loeb Award for Lifetime Achievement in Business and Financial Journalism. Okay, so without any further interruptions from me, I'm going to turn it over to Todd now. So please welcome Todd Zywicki. Congratulations on the book, Todd.
Thank you, Pete. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Mercatus Center for putting on this program today, and Pete's program as well for inviting me to participate as part of this. And obviously one cannot help but be humbled and excited to have Josh Wright and Stephen Pearlstein as commenters on one's work. I'm really looking forward to what they have to say, so I'll try not to tarry too much in terms of laying out an overview of the book. I'd also like to my co-authors, Tom Durkin and Gregory Ellihausen are here today also. And they were, the original book was really their idea, and I was lucky to come along for the ride. But they're both walking encyclopedias of consumer credit, and I've just learned so much from working with Greg and Tom, both of whom are here today. Our third co-author teaches out in Arizona, so he's not here today. So why did we write the book? I think that if you pick up the newspaper, and we'll see this later on, there's a lot of misunderstandings of consumer finance, and in particular, in the wake of the financial crisis, what we're seeing is a lot of really bad ideas that we thought had been thrown away are coming back. And what we're really kind of, I think, in the middle of right now is relearning lessons that we've learned painfully over a century. And there really is a century of sort of modern consumer credit and the study of consumer credit, which really goes back to the 20s, I think, is where we first get sort of early academic study of consumer financial credit. And so I think one of the things we're doing is relearning painfully some of those lessons, as I'll talk about later. And so one of the things I think is useful about this book to the current debate is basically learning all this history that's been lost. A lot of this hasn't really been a part of the academy for quite some time. Most of the best work in consumer credit has been done by government. Both my colleagues, for instance, are Federal Reserve economists. So this, and what we're doing now under the wake of behavioral economics, which I know Josh will talk about, is instead of, not only are we having to try to relearn stuff, but we're learning bad stuff instead. So I think this is useful for that. It's a big book, and it's part of the Oxford University Press Financial Management Association survey and synthesis series. And so partly one of the things we're trying to do is show everything that's come before, and at the same time create a research agenda for the future. Now, when we think about consumer credit, we're all familiar with a lot of the quotes we hear over time about consumer credit and how people misuse consumer credit. These are just a few quotes that kind of resonate, things we read, right? The first one is credit is the latest ally of the devil. It is the great tempter. The two words "charge it" have done more harm than any other in the language. The New York Times has headlines talking about Americans are running in debt and Americans are borrowing trouble. We see this in magazines. We see this in academic commentary here, like the Commercial Law Journal. The luxuries of the last generation are deemed to be necessities. The person who can't pay is nevertheless assured by high-pressure sales talk that he can do so by easily or weekly payments, which only come to a few cents a day. We hear about conspicuous consumption and people using credit to live beyond their means. So we're all familiar with this sort of verbiage. What we may not be familiar with is that the first sentence was written in 1912. The New York Times headlines come from the 70s. That's the 1870s. And so on and so forth as we see down through here. So for instance, the idea of conspicuous consumption and using credit to live beyond your means was promulgated by Thorstein Veblen in 1899. So as long as we've had a credit, we've had people concerned about how other people use credit. And the question is, what's really going on here? Are these perceptions about how people use credit true, or is something else going on? And I think of this as the good old days idea, and I think now Senator Elizabeth Warren, then Professor Elizabeth Warren, kind of sums up the perceptions that people had about how people used to use credit. The credit card industry has no evidence that people were being turned down for loans in the early 1980s. What they have is evidence that people more often in the early 1980s preferred to pay cash than to pay on credit. Now, is that true? Well, this is, I think, one of the key ideas we have in the book, which is, first, why do consumers use credit? And second, what happens when you try to regulate credit? Are consumers benefited or harmed by that? Well, here's a couple historical examples to back what I was saying earlier. This is an advertisement for the New York World newspaper. Apparently, these guys make suits and clothing. Just looking at that, it appears they sell credit because the credit is obviously much more prominently displayed than the goods. This is from the New York Times in 1895. Copperwaite's reliable carpets, advertising to consumers. I like this one as well. Makers are always glad to make contracts when dull times make cash offers valuable. But don't hesitate for lack of money. Our easy credit system makes many things possible. This is 1895, advertising to consumers. And so what's going on in this perceptions we've had over time about people using credit, and what's the reality? Well, before we think about why consumers use credit, let's start off by thinking why businesses use credit. Because most people generally don't think that businesses use credit irrationally or anything like that. And businesses basically use credit for two reasons. The first is to invest in capital goods. So if you need to dig a ditch or a foundation for a home, you could hire 10 guys with the shovels and they could dig a ditch. Or you could hire one guy and buy a backhoe, and you can finance the backhoe on credit and basically use the increased productivity from the capital investment to repay it and make a profit, right? Whether it's a new delivery van, whether it's a new printing press, whether it's a new backhoe, businesses use credit and basically makes them more productive, and out of the increased productivity, they can repay the loan that they borrow. Second reason is smooth income and expenses, right? We just passed so-called Black Friday. Why is it called Black Friday? Because the legend, at least, is that retailers run in the red most of the year, and they make it back on the day after, starting after Thanksgiving is where they make their profits for the year, right? They don't sort of lay people off and hire people every quarter, depending on how their sales go. They use credit to smooth their income and expenses over time. Well, it turns out if you think about consumers use credit for the same reason. The primary reason, and the one we stress in the book, is for capital goods. And if you think about a house, for instance, a house is a capital investment that generates a stream of benefits over time, right? You get to save rent if you live in your house and you have an asset at the end. Student loans are an investment in human capital that increases your productivity, and so in theory at least, you get a higher paying job and you can repay back the student loans. Cars are a good example. Of the value of a car is not having to take a taxi everywhere or walk or forego other opportunities. But you may not think of it this way, but consumer durables have the same effect. So just think about something as humble and simple as a washing machine. What's the value of a washing machine? It's not having to schlep to the laundromat every Saturday night with a pocket full of quarters. It basically is a capital good that gives a stream of benefits over time. Consumers also can use it to smooth income and expenses, which is that if you've got temporary unemployment or some other expenses, you can use credit. A funny example I have is one day I was sitting in my office on like right after the new year, and the phone rings, and it's this reporter, I remember it was from CBS Market Watch, and she calls me up. She says, "Professor Zywicki, I hear you're an expert on credit cards." Yeah. She says, "Well, I've got a question for you. It's like these people went out and they spent all this money, ran up their credit cards during Christmas. What are they going to do when those bills come due?" And I said, "I don't know. What'd they do last year?" She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "And what did they do the year before?" She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Don't you write the same article every year? And every year, don't people pay off they borrow in December and pay it off in January and February?" She didn't use my quote for her story. But it illustrates the point, right, that people can smooth income and expenses. If you need $500 for a car repair, you need $500 whether you got it in the bank or not, right? Now, one of the things we point out in the book is a macroeconomic issue. This is actually sort of interesting because use of consumer credit also tends to be pro-cyclical. So there are some interesting macroeconomic implications that go along with this. But at the level of the individual household, you can see consumers use credit the same way businesses do. And a good example is thinking about cars, which I got interested in this during the auto bailouts, which is one of the sort of interesting business histories of the United States is, of course, Henry Ford was the one who first mass-marketed cars, and they got overtaken very quickly, beginning in the 20s, by General Motors. What happened? Well, part of the story is that General Motors was more stylish and that sort of thing, but partly what it was the GM-AC plan, which is in the 20s, General Motors came up with the idea of basically allowing people to buy a car on credit, right? And you can see why that makes sense. Ford responded by allowing you to buy a car on layaway. And for those youngsters in the crowd, what happens with layaway is you pay for the goods and then you get them at the end. They used to have in department stores, right? So what Ford said is, you can send us a check every month, and after about 10 years, you'll have saved up enough and we'll give you a car. Meanwhile, ride the bus, right? If you understand how absurd it is to buy a car on layaway, then you understand the way it is in which consumers use consumer credit to purchase capital goods. And this is an example and that's the background. That's the history of consumer credit over time. Now, the great change in recent decades, of course, is the introduction of credit cards. And we see, this is just a chart from the Survey of Consumer Finances beginning in 1970. And what we see is the yellow line is the interesting line, of course, which is bank-type cards. It says Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover. And what you see is from 1970 to the present, a very large rise in bank-type cards, right? And access to consumers to bank-type cards. And we also see a downward tick after many years of rising effects. We see a downward tick beginning in around between 2007 and 2010. But what we see also is that retail store cards rose over time and then declined over time. And so what a lot of people say is, okay, this is fine. You could talk about this history, guys, but credit cards have changed the world, right? Credit cards are the real reason that things are so much more perilous for consumers today, as Senator Warren's quote at the beginning said, right? In the 1980s, people used to prefer to pay cash. Now they pay on credit. And they point to credit card ownership. But if you actually look at the data, what you see is that the story that credit cards have led to Americans drowning in indebtedness simply isn't true. This is data. This is the debt service ratio from the Federal Reserve data. And what we see here are 4 lines: the total debt service ratio, the mortgage debt service ratio, the non-revolving debt service ratio, which are these installment loans we were talking about, and the revolving debt service ratio. And this is just to illustrate the point. And what we see over time is that the numbers have remained, and the debt service ratio is the amount of income each household dedicates to servicing their debt in any given month, right? So it's your monthly mortgage payment, it's your monthly student loan payment, it's your monthly car loan payment, and that sort of thing. Now, what we see here, of course, is the pink line is the mortgage debt service ratio. Unsurprisingly, what we see is from 2001 to about 2004, the mortgage debt service ratio went up, right? And the consumer debt service ratio went up. But if you subtract out the mortgage debt service ratio, what do you see? This is a consumer credit burden over time of just revolving and non-revolving debt. Non-revolving being installment loans, red being credit card loans. And what you see is that this number fluctuates, but it pretty much fluctuates between 5 and 7% over time. And in fact, today, it's quite obviously lower than it was in 1980, the period at which Professor Warren said everybody was buying everything on cash. Now, how can that be? Well, if you just look at the green line and the red line, what do you see? From 1980 to about 1996, yes, credit card debt rose. But what do we also see? Non-credit card debt fell, right? How can that be? Well, basically what you see in here is, think about what happened in 1980. What would happen in 1980 if you needed $500 for a car repair? You might go to a local personal finance company and borrow $500 and pay it off over 24 months or whatever at $50 a month. If you needed a bedroom set, what would you do? You go down to the local furniture company. You'd open up a line of credit and you'd pay it off over 36 months. If you bought a refrigerator, you go to the local department store or you go to the local appliance store and you'd open up a line of credit and you'd pay it off on the installment plan, right? Now, if you need $500 for a car repair, you put it on your credit card. If you buy a bedroom set, you put it on your credit card. If you need a refrigerator, you put it on your credit card, right? What we clearly see here is a substitution over time of credit card debt simply substituting for all these other old-fashioned installment loans that people used to use back during that period. And in fact, the striking part about this is not the continued rise in credit card debt, but what? The fact that the non-revolving credit falls till 1992 and then rises after that, up till about 2001. What was that? That was the first bulge of this incredible strapping on of consumer loan debt that we've seen rising over time. And we chart the data in the book but I'm sorry, not consumer debt, student loan debt. Student loan debt, beginning in 1992, student loan debt simply exploded and rose very dramatically for a 20-year period after that. So to the extent that we've seen increased debt, as we can see here, since the mid-90s, it's not credit card debt, it's student loan debt that's really driven this, consumer credit burden. If you look at bankruptcy filers, this is a chart that is not in the book. This is a chart that comes from some of Professor Warren's data. What you see is the same effect, is even with low-income consumers who have filed bankruptcy, what we see over time is that those who have filed bankruptcy, the total debt burden has remained pretty much constant, whereas the credit card debt has increased. And again, what you see is secured debt. All these furniture loans and these other sorts of things that department stores used to offer have declined, but credit cards have simply replaced it. And this is another example I think sort of sums it up. This is a different measurement. This is the ratio of consumer credit to household assets. And what we could see from this, and this is just a longer time series, what we could see is a dramatic rise from 1945 to about 1965, but then pretty much a leveling off after that, which is consistent with this notion of a substitution effect of credit card debt for other types of debt for consumers. Now, if you take this and you think about what this is basically, and I guess if you've got a hammer, everything's a nail, but this is the story of America in the 20th century. Because what is this chart essentially showing us? This is the movement of Americans in the post-war era to the suburbs. This is the movement of people from rented apartments in cities with leased or hand-me-down furniture to the three-bedroom house in Levittown with a car in the garage, brand new furniture, brand new appliances, and everything else. And so what you can see is, this isn't in the book, but it's just a loose correlation. What you can see here is that the rise in the use of consumer credit tracks almost perfectly the rise in the home ownership rate over time, which is as people moved to the suburbs, they financed the American dream through consumer credit. Initially, all of this installment credit that we used to have, and it's been replaced by credit card debt over time, but we see the same basic relationship over time. In the last couple minutes I have left then, I want to just say a few words about how to think about regulation in light of this, and in light of the economics of consumer credit. Now, this is a lesson we're learning very painfully right now, which is in order to make a loan, a lender has to do one of two things. They have to either price the risk accurately or reduce their risk exposure by lending to fewer people or lending less to the same people, right? And so every time you have a consumer credit regulation, you have an intended consequence, which is if you say, for instance, a usury ceiling, which limits interest rates to 10%, most people are not going to make, they're not going to make loans above 10%, right? That's what they'll do. But there is also unintended consequences. And you can think of it, often people think of it as being like a balloon. You can squeeze the cost here, but it's going to pop up somewhere else. And what we see is that there are typically 3 and sometimes 4 unintended consequences associated with regulation. The first is what I call term substitution or term repricing. The second is product substitution. The third is rationing. And the fourth is dynamic effects and competition and the effect it can have on consumer choice. So let's consider each of these. The first is term repricing, which is if you regulate some terms, there are other terms that can be adjusted. So for example, you can regulate the interest rates on credit cards, but if you regulate the interest rates on credit cards, it may just pop up as an annual fee, right? So that you might just impose, so think about old style credit cards. Old style credit cards are subject to usury regulations, but they also typically had a $40 annual fee, for instance. Now, not only was that regressive, because every consumer had to pay $40 regardless of how much they were charging, but it also could have an effect on consumer choice. You wouldn't carry multiple credit cards in that situation. I carry 4 credit cards in my wallet. My credit cards compete for my business every time I stop for a tank of gas. I can't think of any other good or service that I have 4 people competing for my business every single time I make a purchase. That's what my credit cards are. Think about credit cards, right? Nowadays, if you want to compare this to the old personal finance companies I was describing, if I wanted to, I could walk out of here after this lecture today, go to the airport, buy a plane ticket, fly to Germany, go on vacation, get food, hotels, money in an emergency, entertainment, fly back home, take a taxi to my house, all without a penny in my pocket. That's a pretty extraordinary thing when you think about that sort of world that we get from access to consumer credit and electronic payments. But term repricing basically then is the effect that you have of squeezing the balloon in one place and having it pop up somewhere else. So you can regulate interest rates, but it might pop up as the annual fee. It might pop up in terms of other fees. It might pop up in terms of the benefits that you get, such as frequent flyer miles or those sorts of things. Supply and demand still sets the market price, and you can't repeal the laws of supply and demand. The second place you could get is product substitution. And so if you recall that chart at the beginning, I showed how in 1970, most people didn't have bank-type cards, but a lot of people had retail store cards. And one of the reasons, as this study sort of summarizes, if you look at it, is while credit card issuers can impose an annual fee to avoid regulation, retailers had an even better scheme. What could they do? Just raise the price of the goods. And so, for instance, one study found that in Arkansas, which had strict usury ceilings, a refrigerator cost 8% more in Arkansas than it did in Texas, which did not have usury ceilings, right? They could simply bury the cost of the credit in the price of the goods and mark up the price of the goods. So that was one reason why retailers had such a dominant role, was because of their ability to evade usury ceilings more easily. You can also get substitution to things like pawn shops. So if you take Arkansas, for example, which had the strictest usury ceilings in America, very few people could get credit cards in Arkansas because they had a 10% interest rate ceiling. Arkansas also had 3 times as many pawn shops per capita as similar states, right? People still needed credit, and so they couldn't get credit cards, so they turned to things like pawn shops, and pawn shops were typically regulated differently, and also pawn shops have a really good way of evading usury ceilings, which is what? They just give you less for the goods when you come in, right? And so people can shift to pawn shops. Today we see it between payday lending and overdraft protection, bank overdraft protection. When states limit payday lending, or when they get rid of payday lending, consumers make greater use of overdraft protection, which is usually more expensive. You can just substitute from one product to another product. But there's a third effect beyond that, which is rationing, which is after you try to reprice terms and after you try to substitute the legal products, sometimes there is still an unmet need for credit. And there have always been entrepreneurs who are willing to step in and fill the market niche for credit. This is a great headline that Tom Durkin carried around for many years and finally shared it with me. This is from the New York Daily News in 1973, when Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, the head of the Genovese crime family, was indicted for 11 counts of loan sharking, and yes, I don't know if you can read it, one charge of criminal solicitation involving Salerno's alleged order to have an unidentified victim's leg broken. Salerno at this time was running $80 million a day in his territory in New York City. To give you a sense of that, that's $463 million in modern dollars. And this is what was serving a lot of the unmet need in the good old days that Senator Warren pines for, when we had strict regulation of consumer credit. We see this in 1968. A U.S. Senate report found that the second largest revenue source of the mafia was loan sharking, behind only illegal gambling, except loan sharking was more profitable, so they reinvested their gambling profits in loan sharking because it was more profitable. In 1968, Richard Nixon's presidential nomination acceptance speech, he pledged to go, he will appoint an attorney general to go after the loan sharks who are thriving in America's cities in 1968. Right? This is a real thing, that when you regulate away legitimate sources of credit, what we've seen historically is that illegal sources of credit step forward in order to do it. And this is just, I just put up the academic consensus on usury for Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman. And I'm going to jump to my final, my final conclusion then, because I'm running a little bit long. We are in a period now of relearning these lessons the hard way. We've seen cycles of consumer credit regulation in the United States over the past century, which is, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, what we see is people moving into the cities from the farms and immigrants coming in, finding that they have a need for credit. What ends up happening is that the illegal loan sharks step forward and they meet that need. Far-sighted people at the time led to urge deregulation of consumer credit markets on the idea that it was better to allow people to pay high interest rates than getting their legs broken. After the Great Depression, it turns out a theory came about that the Great Depression was caused by too much access to consumer credit. Stop me if you've heard this story before. And so the response was, we need to make consumer credit less available and more restrictive and prevent people from overspending and overborrowing using consumer credit. Such as we just saw, by 1968, the second largest revenue source of the mafia was loan sharking. That led to calls to deregulate consumer credit interest rates, which led to things like payday lending and the like. 2008, we have a financial crisis. What's the response? Too much access to consumer credit. It's okay if consumers don't have as much access to consumer credit. And what we've seen is an onslaught of regulatory stupidity like unprecedented in American history when it comes to this area, from the Credit Card Act of 2009 to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and you name it. The effect has been to systematically choke off credit to consumers, especially low-income consumers. So while hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of low-income consumers have lost access to credit cards, for example, because of the Credit Card Act, payday lending is experiencing double-digit growth, and pawn shops have experienced double-digit growth over the past 5 years. To which Washington's response is what? We got to go after the payday lenders. Well, we know how the story ends. The story doesn't end well. You can pass all the laws that you want, but you can't repeal the law of unintended consequences, and you can't repeal the law of supply and demand. And with that, I'll finish with one last sigh. This is actually an editorial from the New York Times on October 18th, 2014, urging, quote, a rate cap for all consumer loans. That we need to have a national usury ceiling of 36% that will apply to all consumer loans. Well, Fat Tony's successors are probably warming up in the bullpen and spreading that around the New York State Legislature in Congress as we speak. Thank you.
I am very pleased to be here. My other job gets me exhausted, so anytime I get a chance to come back to Mason, where I was for the first decade of my career, I'm very, very happy. Let me get a couple of preliminary things out of the way. One, my day job is that I am the commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. That means there are some other commissioners, and I can't speak for them. So the stuff I say belongs to me, not to them or anybody else. So there you have that. Two, I am going to talk about behavioral economics and consumer credit, which is a part of the focus in the wonderful book that Todd sort of gave you the summary of. It's a narrow part, but I think an important part. I think Todd placed into context very important economic and regulatory history of consumer credit and talked a lot about what's old, and what's old sort of continues on. And I want to talk a little bit about what's new, or at least purports to be new, which is the injection of behavioral economics into the consumer credit debate. I owe an intellectual debt to Todd for getting me interested in this area. It came largely from Todd complaining. Every day when we went to go get coffee or lunch or some such, about how Liz Warren or somebody, some academic somewhere, had written these papers pretending to do some economics, and it was this behavioral stuff, and I said, you know, leave me alone, I'm an antitrust guy. Over there, people are doing, there's some real economics happening, I'm happy over there, it's a, good consulting life, leave me alone. And Todd just, fine, I'll read your article. It sort of got me a little interested, and I started writing pieces, and I've written a good deal about the behavioral economics literature since. So an intellectual debt to Todd, a political debt because of this Todd owes to me, because later Senator Warren became a little more interested in my nomination to the commission than I would have liked, largely for things that I wrote on these topics. So you owe me one, Todd. So let me get started about the interaction of behavioral economics and sort of located in the consumer credit regulation space, which is something the FTC does some of, but sort of now is largely over in the hands of the CFPB. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I will, at the end, say all of the things that I want to say about the entire book. It's wonderful. You have to read the book to know what's in it. You should go get it. But I'm going to talk largely about what's in Chapter 4 to do with behavioral economics. In that chapter, the book sort of sets forth its primary thesis to do with what to do about all of these claims about behavioral economics, saying that we need more consumer credit regulation, and more than that, that we need to sort of overturn the rational choice neoclassical economic paradigm and sort of govern the consumer credit space for a long time. So the primary thesis is that old model, the price theory, neoclassical model of thinking about the supply and demand for consumer credit with rational actors on sort of all sides is wrong and should be supplanted because of the behavioral economics literature. It gets very popular. We'll talk about some of this. And there's a wonderful detailed discussion in the book about how this happened, the causes and consequences of the rise of behavioral economics, and more importantly, behavioral law and economics, that is sort of the implementation of ideas in the behavioral economics literature into law and regulation, that I'm going to make the focus of what I talk about. I think to do that, I want to set the table a little bit. Some of you may sort of know what's in the behavioral economics literature. Some of you may not. Some of you may have read some of the popular books like Nudge and so forth that give a little bit of an idea. I'm going to go in a little bit more detail in talking about what behavioral economics is and is not, and why it really matters for thinking about implications for consumer credit. Talk a little bit about the rise of behavioral law and economics, which receives a wonderful treatment in the book, and then talk about sort of how we carry this over to consumer credit and its regulation. So some stuff, we'll sort of go backwards, some stuff about what behavioral economics is not to begin with. And is often asserted in discussions about the relevance of behavioral economics to insert a new subject of regulation, antitrust, consumer credit, bankruptcy, tort law, contract law, IP, you name it, that behavioral economics is the insight that people make mistakes, and so all of the old economics is wrong, and that's as foolish as it sounds. It did not take economists 300 years of any stripe to recognize that people err. In fact, there are chapters upon chapters upon chapters in any standard economics textbook that you get out where rational people make mistakes because of imperfect information, because of asymmetric information, because of principal agent problems. None of this is about the observation that people err, which is sort of boring and you all knew before you got here, but has little to do with the debate between behavioral economics and what I'll call rational choice economics, but you can insert whatever term you like. So this is a graph that comes out. George Stigler had this graph in the 1960s. He says, what happens if we start thinking about information like we think about widgets, and we think about it having, costs and benefits and their supply and demand for types of information? What kind of insights could we draw? He said, well, if you think about, he started thinking about search costs, right? You want to go buy a cup of coffee. I buy a lot of coffee. I worked here, and I know there's coffee at Starbucks, there's Kosi's, there's something that passes as coffee in the faculty lounge. A couple other places I could go around and get prices of coffee. Right? And so he's thinking about how much information do you want? Well, there's some benefit of getting more information, right? And that's going to decline over time as I have more of a sense. Maybe if I go check 5 more stores, I could find somewhere where I get a nickel discount on coffee, right? But the marginal benefit goes down as I get more information, right? And the marginal cost of going out to further stores increases. This is the way we think on the margin about other goods and services. And so Stigler said, this is what you get Nobel Prizes for in economics sometimes. The optimal amount of ignorance isn't 0, right? The optimal amount of information is not infinite, right? We weigh the marginal cost and benefits. I'll leave it as an exercise to the reader that the graph implies people make mistakes, and they can be efficient mistakes, right, in equilibrium. So this is where we get to why behavioral economics is a big deal, right? If we think about the baseline sort of rational choice thing, I'm going to, individuals maximize, firms maximize, everybody's maximizing something, okay? And rational decision making is perfectly consistent with error, because perfection is costly and pretty darn costly for most of us. Now, lots of stuff out of the standard model where everybody is maximizing something, but the big deal in terms of consumer credit and its regulation that comes out of the rational choice model is the idea that economists call revealed preference. Right? If I put an apple and an orange in front of you and you keep on picking the apple, I learn you like apples more than oranges. Okay? It's simple. Okay? If I put two things in front of you and you choose one, I learn something about your relative values of one over the other. The idea of revealed preference is by your action, by your choice, you've revealed something about your preferences over apples, and I think I was using oranges. Okay? I strangely want a banana, so I'm thinking about switching. But that's my problem, not yours. So it's the idea of revealed preference. The punchline, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples, but the punchline about behavioral economics is going to be, let's take away revealed preference and do some economics. And it turns out that's going to be really hard. Okay? And it's going to be really hard if you take away the idea of revealed preference to say, I've got a regulatory intervention in mind, and I know it's going to make consumers better off. Why? Because they're going to make some choices, and you just told me I can't use their choices to say anything about welfare. So there's going to be a belief system that you're going to have to carry with you in your pocket somewhere, or sort of more deep inside, to be able to believe that you're making people better off. Okay? But the main idea is we're going to strike at the heart of revealed preference, and that's what behavioral economics is about. We can't trust the choice when you choose the apple over the orange, and there are stories for why you may not want to trust that choice, and we'll talk about sort of all of those. But that's the big deal, right? Behavioral economics says, if you take away this revealed preference idea, I've got lots of experiments, some in labs, some in markets, in which people make systematic mistakes. They keep on choosing the apple, but I have some evidence that they really want the orange. Okay? And so let's sort of throw out revealed preference as showing that the choice of the apple increased welfare for the consumer. All right, so pictures of guys who did behavioral economics. Let's give some examples of what we mean. So the literature, this is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers. I just want to do a couple of stylized examples. Some come from laboratory experiments. Some come from the psychology literature. There are some limited field experiments that implement some of this stuff. So some of this is real. You know people who are going to make the mistakes I'm going to show you. I make the mistakes I'm going to show you. Okay? And I'm going to suggest to you that that really doesn't matter very much for the regulation of consumer credit. So if we do, so this is just sort of one of the examples that's very well known in the literature. Framing bias. So we have lots of biases in decision making. Some are going to have to do with context. So half of the behavioral economics literature is in certain contexts, right, how we frame the apple and the orange in my example. If I put the apple up high and the orange down low or some such, you're going to make inconsistent decisions. You say you like apples more than oranges, but if the apple's on the bottom of the shelf, you don't pick it, or something like that. So here's an example of a framing bias. So we give these survey questions. Is the percentage of African countries that belong to the UN more or less than 10%? And somebody answers yes or no, and then we ask the follow-up question, what's the percentage? Same setup, just change the number. Okay. Objectively, you have some idea of what you think the percentage is. It shouldn't switch between the answers. It turns out that it does. People think that the questioner is sort of suggesting some information, all right? This is going to take a long time to read. Just trust me that the two examples on both sides of the slides are the same example. These are, there's a disease outbreak. It's expected to kill 600 people. There are two alternative programs, and we give the choice and we frame it this way. Your choice on the left side is 200 people will be saved. In program B, there's a third of a chance that you save 600 people, and 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. So your expected value here is to save 200 people. Here you do it with certainty. I leave as an exercise to the reader in the interest of time that this is the same darn thing, only we've said that this is people dying instead. Turns out people make mistakes. People make mistakes with probabilities. I've got 5 minutes, so we're going to go fast. People make mistakes. The most famous one is the endowment effect. Okay? The endowment effect experiment is sort of the crown jewel of the behavioral economics literature. You go into a classroom, you give somebody a George Mason mug or a pen or some such, and we extract valuations and we see if they trade. And it turns out in some of these experiments that are the basis for a lot of the endowment effect, people don't trade in a manner that's consistent with the valuations. There are lots of experiments, just if you're interested in the endowment effect stuff in the behavioral economics literature, lots of literature that says most of those experiments, what we're detecting is sort of not behavioral biases, but there's something in the way the experiments are being done that drives the results. And if you let people go do this in markets instead of classroom, most of the time the effects go away. 401ks, same thing. This is the one I want to set up for credit cards, all right? So the big one, the big behavioral bias in the consumer credit literature has to do with inconsistent preferences due to impatience of the consumer, right? So you have a choice in front of you. You're going to eat chocolate today with delayed health consequences, but immediate gratification because you like chocolate, or you can eat fruit today, but you get your benefit comes tomorrow, okay? So we ask people in the surveys, what do you choose today for you to eat next week? Next week, you always choose, starting tomorrow, I am going to have the healthy thing. I will have fruit. I'll have it tomorrow. Just today, I'm going to have the chocolate. And then you wake up tomorrow, and it's today again. And it's awesome because you have to have chocolate, and it's consistent with your rule. It's always tomorrow that you have the fruit. And these are pictures that do that and so forth. Okay. All right. So lots of people got tenure off behavioral law and economics. That's this chart. Okay. Like a whole lot of people got tenure. Yeah, okay. So outside the world of behavioral consumer credit, the response to the behavioral law and economics literature has largely been, let's ban stuff or tax stuff, okay? So we might tax cigarettes. We might say people don't understand the full price of cigarettes because they don't understand the risk of smoking, so we need to increase the tax. The endowment effect, we can't trust people to trade consistent with the valuations, so don't give property rights to somebody because they don't know how to value the thing that they made. So, take away the right to get injunctions and give damages, right? Weaken the property right, okay? So here's your list of behavioral biases from Wikipedia. There are like 400. And one of the challenges, and I won't talk about this much, although it's discussed somewhat in the book, is that you have 400 experiments doing 400 biases, and we have no idea how they interact. You have a better idea because you know people, and you're like a guy or girl with has these 400 biases, and you deal with them the way you deal with them, like you deal with everything else to try to sort of make coherent your decision making. Right? Let me walk through one consumer credit experiment to sort of give a sense of why this is a high stakes problem and sort of the difference between BE and rational choice regulation matter. Right? So this is from a paper, and this has actually been replicated a bunch of times. So imagine the following experiment. Consumers are given a choice between these two credit cards. A zero annual fee card with high rewards and amenities and a high interest rate also, or you pay an annual fee up front. You get no amenities, but you get a low interest rate. So card one has like a picture of your dog on it, and you get airline miles, and it's pretty, and it has no annual fee, but has a really high interest rate. And card two, you pay an annual fee, and like you can't put a picture of your puppy on it, but it does have a lower interest rate. And so what do people pick? Good old-fashioned rational choice economics says, and you don't even need any economics to figure this out. If you're a person who revolves debt, you want the card with the lower interest rate. Okay? Also knew this before you got here, okay? If you revolve debt, you want the lower interest rate. If you don't, you really want to put your puppy on the card and get the miles, okay? The interest rate doesn't matter, right? So a bunch of papers, Liz Warren, Orrin Bargill, sort of the primary behavioral bias driving the regulatory debate is consumers can't price consumer credit products. In the credit card context, this is chocolate and fruit. The consumer thinks with the zero annual fee, they're getting something today. They don't know how to price that this thing they have a longer high interest rate tomorrow. They think they're not going to have debt tomorrow, but they're wrong. They're gonna, okay? And so this is a chocolate and fruit problem, Well, we can test this, and people did. I give this as a quiz to people. They never get it right, so do your own answer, but I've got like 20 seconds, so I'm going to go fast. How many people pick the right card? Okay? Think of your answer, think of your answer. Okay? Turns out 60, about 60%. The majority get it right. Now, what are the regulatory implications of that? Well, if you like the fact that 40% get it wrong the first time, you can pick that to talk about if you'd like. But there's a little bit more in the study. So the average cost of an error is about $25. It's about the size of an annual fee. Turns out if you run the experiment again, about 80% get it right the second time, more the third time. People learn from their mistakes. Again, stuff you didn't need me to tell you, but you may need to tell the CFPB. Now, about 10% of the market, they're going to get it wrong all the time. You also know that guy, okay? Okay? I know that guy too, okay? Now what do you want to do? If you think the cause of the error is because people aren't pricing stuff because it's not disclosed, you have a disclosure regime. Right? You make people disclose what the interest rate is. You try to talk to consumers about what the price of the card is. Plug for my agency, by the way. There's a great Bureau of Economics in which a number of fantastic economists have spent a lot of time talking about how actual consumers respond to different disclosures, right? How they perceive different costs and benefits of cards. This is the revealed preference bit. Okay? You want to make sure when the consumer picks 1 over 2, it knows what it's picking. Okay? And it turns out they do all of the evidence, and there's more, and there's a great discussion of a lot of the evidence in the book. But I'm sort of harping on this as a sort of representative example. But if you think the problem is people the terms are hidden, well, there's a disclosure regime. And it turns out all the evidence says people do pretty well with credit cards. Okay? Do pretty darn well with credit cards. And the cost, interestingly enough, the behavioral story here, you think about the 40% that are errors, the behavioral story turns a little bit worse. Most of the errors people make, right, the behavioral story should be if you're a revolver, you behave like a non-revolver. Right? You think that you're going to get a raise, and you're not, sorry. And so you get the card that you would get if you were going to be a non-revolver. You get the puppies and the miles, right? But you have the high interest rate, and then you get hit tomorrow because you have debt. Most of the mistakes actually go the other way, right? So more than half the mistakes are consumers who really should be getting the high interest rate card but don't, right? That's just what the data say, okay? Here's the problem. So if you think it's disclosure, you do disclosure. That's a revealed preference, sort of rational choice regime. If you think that it's something else, what does the behavioral law and economists do with this data? Right? They don't think that it's people are sort of just not pricing the stuff correctly. If they continue to see the consumer pick the card with the high interest rate and a lot of benefits, they just don't believe that's the right choice. Okay? The data says the people are getting right, that it's welfare maximized, and they just don't think it's the right choice. And so what you see is that you will not get disclosure proposals, but instead you get things that restrict the choice set of the consumer. Okay? You get things that say, well, goodness, we keep on nudging them, nudge, name of the book, all of that. You keep on nudging them to take the other card, and they just won't listen. Well, let's not let them pick card 1. Right? Let's tax card 1. Okay. Let's force sellers to offer card 2 to them first and tell them card 2 is really, really awesome, but also we happen to sell card 1. That's the plain vanilla rule. Okay. So I'm out of time, but let me stop there and just say, as this relates to the CFPB, because nobody's really talked about it yet, is that the choice that you make, whether you think that the underlying problem whether you think that the consumer credit market ought to be thought of with rational choice economics or behavioral economics, has a lot to do with what you think the right regulatory prescriptions are. A ton to do with it. Okay? You look at this data and you're a behavioral law and economist and you're convinced by that data. I'm trying to tell you shouldn't be. And I think the book does a great job of sort of convincing you that you shouldn't be. Then disclosure is not enough, and you get into a world of bans and so forth. And placed in context, I think one of the great contributions of the book is that we have run those experiments before. We didn't have lots of law professors with tenure saying they were a good idea, or maybe we did, but we've run them before and they've all turned out pretty poorly. So I think whether you're a student of rational choice economics or of history or of the history of regulation, all of which are dimensions covered in the book, the story sort of ends up being the same. But it's a book that's especially timely because you have a regulatory agency whose intellectual DNA is built on behavioral economics that tells you this is how we see the data. So I think this is an important counterweight to that and worth reading. And I commend it to all of you and thank Todd and your co-authors for taking the time to write it. I will stop there. Thank you.
I agreed to do this talk many months ago before they sent the book. And that was very rational choice of them. Because when I received it, I found out that it was 640 pages, and by the way, the type is very small. So, I thought that, oh boy, this is going to be too heavy for me. And one thing about me is, unlike the other three people here, I think I'm right about that, I'm not an economist, and I'm not a lawyer, and so I'm not going to try to be one. So you'll have to take my comments coming from where they do, which is I'm a journalist with no particular expertise other than I've observed a lot for a long time. So first of all, congratulations to Todd and Tom and Greg and Michael, who's not here. They have put out an important book. It certainly covered the waterfront with a comprehensive look of the development of modern consumer credit, which they aptly demonstrate makes more credit available to more people at a lower cost than at any time in history and in any place in the world. That's thanks in large part to new technology such as the securitization of credit and the development of sophisticated credit scoring software. And all of that is laid out very nicely in the book. This is a book about the democratization of consumer credit. I liked in particular the focus on credit cards, which have revolutionized our payment system, as Todd nicely described, and made our lives incalculably more convenient and made the retail sector more efficient, all the while providing needed capital, not just to consumers, by the way, but to many small businesses, and allowed families to buy homes and cars and durable goods at a younger age, and provided a safety valve for people to handle sudden and unexpected loss of income or expenses. I'll tell you briefly a story. My dad owned a clothing store in Boston, and when I was little on Saturdays, I used to go in with him to work, and I used to go and work in the office. And this store had, like many stores, had a store charge, so you could have an account with the store, and most of the customers were regulars, and they did have one. And so you had to send out a bill every month. And we had this machine, I think it was a Pitney Bowes machine. And so every time someone would come in and buy, 2 suits and 3 shirts and 4 ties, you had to put all of those things in. There was no computers, okay? So this is the beginning of computers, and the chits were written out by hand, and then they went up to the office. And then at the end, and everyone's bills were collected by alphabet, and then at the end of the month, if you might have more than one bill, they tabulated it and they sent you a monthly bill. And so there was this machine, and it was from about here to about here. And there was this very large woman who ran this very large machine. And over here were the buttons you pushed, and then they had to have 3 copies of the bill. So you put one in here, and then you put a second one in here. That one's the one that goes to the customer. This is the one that goes into the file in the office under the customer. This is the one that goes into the date file, so that every bill goes out on a certain date. There's a date file, okay? And then you go and every transactions you put in all the transactions, the code for whether it's a suit or a tie, how much money, and the date. You put all of those things in. and then you press the button, and this thing goes ka-da-chunk, 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 and then ka-da-chunk, ka-da-chunk, and then, you know, it made a lot of noise. Anyway, I used to go in and I used to do this with this woman. She would do the pushing of the buttons, and I would put the things in, and she would do this all month long. Okay, and then at some point in time, they bit the bullet, and they said, my dad said, actually my uncle said, you know, this is crazy. We got to take credit cards. Now, there was a cost to that, which was the credit card company takes 2% or 1% or 3% or whatever it was in those days. And, but all that went away. The machine went away. Miss Anderson went away. And, you know, it's much more efficient. They have all sorts of data that they can analyze their sales in. People get, you know, people can look thing. They only have to carry one card in the wallet. Most of you are too young to remember this, but women used to go around in their pocketbook with this thing full of these heavy metal plates for every department store that they shopped at. You don't have to do that now. Anyway, that's just a little anecdotal stuff about saying that the growth of the credit card industry has been a good thing. I appreciated the good sense of history throughout the book, by the way. And I also appreciated the jibes at Elizabeth Warren. But given my own well-known views, you probably didn't invite me here to Mercatus to tell you what's right with this book. So let me mention a few areas where I would part company with Tom and Greg and Michael and Todd. There are, it seems to me, some curious inconsistencies in this book. We are meant to believe that borrowers are rational enough to know their own best interests in taking out loans. But we were also asked to believe that they're too stupid to know their own interests when lobbying for public policies. We learn that wiping out debt for the overly indebted is a great thing for the economy when applied to corporations that borrow in the form of limited liability corporations and corporate bankruptcy, but it's terrible when it's extended to consumers in the form of personal bankruptcy. We're told that consumers are systematically misled by ideologically motivated reporters into taking suboptimal amounts of debt. But apparently, these consumers are never misled by the hundreds of millions of dollars in credit card company advertising and direct mail, urging them to take out as much debt as possible. In fact, credit card marketing is rarely mentioned at all in the book. We are presented with numerous studies that purport to prove that the spike in personal bankruptcies is not the result of people taking on excessive debt. It's not about people having medical bills and rising uninsurance rates for health care. It's not the result of layoffs or stagnant wages that are caused by trade or technology. Rather, the reason for the increase in personal bankruptcies is high taxes and marketing by plaintiffs' lawyers. Imagine that. And we are told that the runaway Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is now the most powerful, least accountable regulator in the history of civilization, because it has an independent source of money, and because its top official serves for fixed term and cannot be removed by either the president or the Congress. Sounds to me like it's pretty similar to the thing called the Federal Reserve, established in 1913, whose top executives cannot be removed by anyone, appointed for 14-year fixed terms, and which has its own source of money. I might add that given a choice between a seat on the Federal Reserve Board and the seat on the CFPB, I'd say that the more powerful, if anyone was interested in power, they would probably take the Federal Reserve. But allow me to dig in a little deeper on some of these issues. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but only somewhat so, to say that anyone who reads this book might come away unaware that we had a financial crisis in 2008 that happened because a huge credit bubble finally burst. The attitude seems to be that there was no credit bubble and that the banks and credit card companies were not responsible for it. While much of the early part of the book focuses on government regulation and social norms that result in there being too little credit in the economy, no thought seems to be given to the possibility that there ever might be too much credit in the economy. For if there were too much credit, then some people might be tempted to limit it in some fashion, particularly the bad kind of credit the market did not eliminate on its own. Let's take the example of balloon loans to low-income households that are made without down payment, without verification, or without proof of the ability to repay. We know that such loans were made. We know that a lot of them were made. And we know that more than the predicted number turned out to be bad. And the reason was twofold. One, based on historical models, lenders and borrowers assumed that the collateral behind the loans could only increase in value, meaning that the ability to repay was really irrelevant. And two, repayment didn't matter anyway in the eyes of the lender, because by the time anything could possibly go wrong, the original lender would have sold that sucker to some unsuspecting investor. And yet nowhere could I find in the 640 pages any serious discussion of the failure of banks' vaunted computer models to come close to predicting these default rates, or whether those mistakes could happen again. Nor was there any discussion of the moral hazard that is deeply embedded in the securitization system by which consumer loans are now routinely packaged and sold, with little or no residual risk retained by the original lender. Of course, it's true that if you impose regulations to deal with those kind of market failures and stop that kind of lending, you'll get less lending, or, as Todd points out, less legal lending. And here's a little secret that I can share with you about the people who write those regulations. They really do understand that in the course of preventing some bad lending, they will inevitably prevent some good lending. So it's not particularly surprising to find econometric studies showing that such regulations result in suboptimal levels of lending, particularly if you define suboptimal as any system that excludes some loans that a willing borrower and willing lender would have otherwise wanted to consummate. That's just tautological. Of course, there's suboptimal lending by that standard. Which brings me to a second observation about this book. There's an unfortunate tendency among economists to equate human welfare or well-being solely with maximizing output or income or job creation, things that can be easily denominated in dollars and cents and quantified on databases. But the reality is that there are big negative externalities from credit bubbles and financial crises that are not captured by standard economic data. Loss of confidence and a sense of personal economic security, political polarization and loss of social cohesion, spikes in depression, divorce, illness, and suicide, abandonment of entire neighborhoods because of a vicious self-reinforcing cycle of declining home values, foreclosure, crime, and neglect. We also are happier when our neighbors are happy, and our communities are prosperous, and collective institutions are strong and vibrant. And when they're not, irrespective of our own individual and that's irrespective of our own individual prosperity. None of these factors are considered in any of the analyses I saw in the book. The attitude toward credit bubbles seems to be no harm, no foul. The authors also reject out of hand any notion of abusive or predatory lending. These have quotes around them. Now, I know they're hard. Those are topics and definitions that are hard to define. I'm a little skeptical of them as well. But we do know from experience that it's not always the case that anything entered into, any agreement entered into by two parties voluntarily is always welfare maximizing. In the markets for loans, there are serious and persistent asymmetries of information, as Josh points out, asymmetries of information, asymmetries of knowledge, asymmetry of sophistication. As Larry Summers would say, there's a lot of stupidity out there. There's also fraud that's hard to detect. There's also herd behavior and unfounded optimism on the part of both lenders and borrowers. And there's lots of agents feathering their nests at the hands of principals who trusted them. It may be that competitive markets eventually correct for all these standard imperfections, but in the process, a lot of people can get hurt. And the pain that is caused to those people, some of whom are perfectly innocent bystanders, offends our sense of fairness. Fairness is something we value. It's something that contributes to our individual and our collective well-being, so much so that we're willing to trade off a little economic efficiency to get it. But none of the economic analysis in this book assigns any value to fairness or makes allowances for such trade-offs. The only financial regulations Tom, Greg, Michael, and Todd seem to support are those requiring greater disclosure and transparency, which in theory can take care of many of these, at least the informational asymmetries. But in practice, we know that the financial service companies and their lawyers have made a mockery of this remedy. These disclosures now make our eyes glaze over as we sign under deadline pressure, paper after paper acknowledging that we've been told all sorts of gobbledygook, intentionally written gobbledygook, I might add, that we don't understand. And I might add that some of the regulatory agencies, including the Federal Trade Commission, has done a lousy job at policing that. In fact, that was one of the reasons that the CFPB got some political support, was because those other agencies had done such a bad job. Now, somewhere in those contracts and disclosures, there used to be a clause in the credit card case that the credit card company could raise the interest rate anytime it wants to, not only on all future purposes, which you could understand, but even on the purchases that you already made in the past. Now, I don't know anybody who thinks that's fair, other than people who are employees or lobbyists of credit card companies, and maybe the authors of this book. And since the credit card industry is a tight oligopoly, and all credit card companies conveniently followed that policy, disclosure and competition were inadequate to rectify that kind of one-sided arrangement. That's what I would call abusive. Now, thanks to the dreaded Dodd-Frank law, such provisions are outlawed. And I'm pretty sure if you ask them, most credit card customers would say that was a good thing, even after you told them that some high-risk, high-volume borrowers will be denied credit as a result of that. That's a trade-off most of us would be willing to make. And why? Because someday we know it could very well be us getting the short end of that stick. For consumers, regulation can be a form of insurance, which we understand comes with a premium, like all insurance. We risk-averse humans have a tendency sometimes to overinsure. Actually, behavioral economists will tell you that. But it makes us happier, even though a neoclassical economist would tell us that it shouldn't. Now, you can imagine I was particularly interested in the criticism running through the book of the press for stirring up fears about taking on too much debt and taking the side of the consumers against the credit card companies. I'll tell you that I enjoy a good press bashing as much as the next fellow. But at my age, it's become a little bit tiresome to remind people who are quite sophisticated that in the news business we have a natural bias to cover the planes that crash rather than the thousands of planes that land safely every day. If we are to be faulted for anything, in fact, it is for not writing all those sob stories about people who got in over their head. If we are to be criticized for anything, it's not for writing those sob stories about people who got in over their heads during the boom and came to regret it. Rather, we should be criticized for writing all those cheerleading stories before the bubble burst about home prices and stock prices and bond prices that entered a new era that would those prices would continue to go up, creating wealth and prosperity and home ownership for everyone. Now I admit, as the authors allege, that there are personal finance writers, like certain grandmothers, who are continually warning people not to take out too much debt, citing all those scary statistics about soaring unpaid balances on credit card bills. But maybe there's a good reason for that. I point out to you that procreation is rather essential for the survival of the species, but you don't see a lot of columnists and experts nagging people to have more sex. The instinct to have sex, like the instinct to consume, is already pretty well hardwired into our nature. The purpose of personal finance columns is to tame such natural appetites. It's not a matter of being balanced. It actually serves a useful social purpose. One of the things I admire about Mercatus is its willingness to resist the intellectual straitjacket imposed by political correctness. We liberals can be insufferably self-righteous sometimes. But I have to say that even for my taste, the authors stepped over the line in the chapter about discrimination and regulations designed to prevent race and sex discrimination in lending. On this topic, I find the quickest way to get dismissed out of hand is to tell people who have seen and experienced discrimination firsthand that it couldn't possibly exist, because if it did, those who had a taste for it would be driven out of business. We have ample evidence that social norms can be extremely powerful in shaping people's behavior, even their economic behavior, and even in cases where it runs against their rational economic interests. Contrary to the allegedly empirical findings in the book, the taste for discrimination was indeed widespread. The markets were indeed slow to correct for it. And anyone who failed to find evidence of systematic discrimination probably wasn't looking very hard. Some of us are old enough to remember when women couldn't get a checking account, let alone a loan, unless it was co-signed by their husband or father. Or when banks routinely redlined certain neighborhoods in which no mortgage loans were made. Or when blacks were required to put up more collateral and pay higher interest rates than whites with similar credit profiles, if they were allowed in the bank at all. Political exclusion, segregated housing, job and housing discrimination, racial profiling, and law enforcement, these were all mutually enforcing. Which is why automated underwriting, which may be a big step in the way to getting discrimination out of consumer lending, may not be the final answer. Criteria that may look like they are benign may not be. It may be true, by the way, that the tools government has at its disposal to prevent, detect, and punish discriminatory lending are imperfect. It's also possible they carry a short-term economic cost. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use them. They are part of a much wider effort to break the pervasive, invidious cycle of discrimination that, when used properly, has made ours a more just society and allowed more than half of our population, the part that wasn't male and that wasn't white, to realize its full human and, yes, their full economic potential. If the price for such product is a couple of decades of slightly suboptimal lending and inconvenience for bankers and less than maximized bank profits, it's a price most of us would be willing to pay. There may be a time when social norms have changed to the point where these imperfect and burdensome regulations will become unnecessary. But recent events in Ferguson and Charlottesville remind us that we've probably not reached that point quite yet. Thank you.
We have roughly 10 minutes for questions. Raise your hand if you have a question, and Justin will bring you the mic.
Commissioner Wright may have to leave because he's got another speech downtown. So.
Yeah.
It's nothing you said.
That's,
I just had a quick question. You mentioned in the talk that in aggregate, consumer credit is pro-cyclical, but the household sees it to smooth consumption. So that would seem to imply that it should be counter-cyclical. So I just wanted to hear the short story of why that isn't a contradiction.
well, households can use it to smooth consumption and income. But basically what happens is when the economy grows, people borrow more. So it's there's kind of two forces pushing in different directions, which is consumers can use it to smooth over things. But at the same time, so I'll just give a story. Another example from a reporter was a reporter called me and said, you know, the economy's heading into recession. This is about 2007. What are we going to do with all these people who are borrowing so much money? And I said, well, they'll probably just start borrowing less. And she said, what? And I said, well, that's what people do, right? It's not, you don't drive 100 miles an hour over the cliff, right? You put on the brakes when you see the cliff approaching. So in the aggregate, when the economy tends to slow down, people borrow a little bit less. And so, I mean, I think that's there's an interesting macroeconomic regulatory question there about counter-cyclical lending policy and that sort of thing. But the fact that consumers can use it to deal with specific unemployment and that sort of thing isn't consistent with the idea that if the economy is slowing down, that they start borrowing less. I mean, you guys. Tom would have probably answered that differently for me, it looks like.
Easier to get it from this side.
Not considering necessarily the level or the specific types of regulation, and noting that there are obviously some differences in views on the panel. I'm curious about the manner in which the regulations that we do have are enacted, and specifically looking at enforcement actions versus more formal rulemaking structure, and whether it's from research or from experience, how does the regime that the CFPB appears to be entering into what we've seen so far differ or reflect the way in which consumer credit regulation was enacted in the past?
Josh, do you want to comment on that?
You can go first if you like. I mean, I can compare some things to I didn't get to this in the talk, but in terms of the structure of the authority granted to the CFPB, sort of aside from its organization and independence and those issues, just sort of the structure of the Consumer Protection Authority, it walks and talks quite a bit like the FTC authority. I do want to correct Steve on one thing, although it's an easy mistake to make, which is the FTC, lots of agencies got knocked for not being on the job with respect to consumer credit. We are statutorily precluded, so we couldn't have done it if we wanted to, and we in fact went to Congress and said, please let us do it, not them.
No, but you do other kinds of disclosures which are also similarly opaque.
Not for banks.
I understand that.
Right. So in any event, we probably, by the way, are the only agency that does any research on the topic. But that aside, with respect to the authority, they've got deception and they've got unfairness and they've got abusive practices. The abusive we don't have, and I think that part has attracted a lot of scrutiny because, you know, sort of what does that mean? Is it an unconscionability standard or you know, or what? Now, I think the major concern that I have is that there is in the bill something that says, hey, when we have the deception authority is easy. This is fraud. We bring hundreds of cases. They're 5-0 voted cases. The fraud is bad, right? So it gets voted like it's bad. The CFPB does the same. And the unfairness authority, which is sort of other stuff, and probably what you would use to attack alternative lending products, not on the basis that there's deception, but that they're bad for the world in some way. Our framework requires, by statute, a cost-benefit analysis of the economic harms and benefits of the thing at issue. The Dodd-Frank bill says, hey, we will try to talk to the FTC and harmonize and take the same approach. I think there's some concern that that's not happened and that there's no statutory requirement that they have that sort of cost-benefit analysis, any sort of cost-benefit analysis, a demonstration that the thing that we're banning or regulating will do more good than harm isn't hard baked in. I think it's a little early to have returns on what that looks like, and so we'll see. But I think that is an important difference in terms of the legal structure that I think is something to watch.
I'll just add two quick things. One of the things we talk about in the book is that traditionally one of the impacts of the way consumer credit has been regulated is that it tended to have a negative redistribution effect, which is to say that it tends to, like usury ceilings, for instance, tend to redistribute wealth from lower income to middle class consumers for a variety of reasons that we talk about. And there's good political reasons why that is, or at least historically it even redistributed to upper income, high wealth consumers. Second thing is I think more interesting, which is in the terms of regulatory structure now, where we do have this more discretionary enforcement type regime. Some of it's not even formal enforcement, right? It's sort of the auto dealer example. And what we have are kind of two different visions, I think, of regulation, and I think Stephen's comments allude to a little bit, which is some people say we've got to have a lot of discretion because the bad guys are so slick, and we've got to be able to catch them, right? And that if you just write rules, then people figure out how to get around the rules, borrowers and lenders. The flip side is that can also have a cost, right? If you look at mortgages, for instance, both Wells Fargo and J.P. Morgan Chase have announced that they're leaving that they're not making mortgages to low-income consumers anymore. The reason is because the regulatory and other risks and liability risks are too high, putbacks and that sort of thing. And the result has been that you've got a bunch of sort of unregulated lenders filling the space that they are vacating, right? And so there's always a trade-off there, right? Which is, it said you got to be able to predict your risk in order to make a loan. More discretionary enforcement means less predictability, which means higher rates for everybody and less access to credit. And that's the unintended consequence. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, is the bottom line question.
We have time for one more question, but I just want to add something to what Todd said because economic reasoning actually is really hard. And one of the reasons why it's hard is because if you're really good at economics, you recognize multiple margins of adjustment and that are caused by shifts in relative prices, change in the rules, which will shift the relative price of the behavior. And I think in a lot of this discussion, people confuse consequences with cause. So they see a margin of adjustment that they don't like, say, for example, Fat Tony, and then they think somehow that that's a consequence of a market failure. It is a market for loans. It's done in this other area, but the cause isn't the market. The cause is the regulations that generated that adjustment on the margin. And I think if you go back and look, and if you go through the history of this, sort of in consumer credit, and you think about things even with the most recent financial crisis, you have to look and see what the multiple margins of adjustments that were made in the different industries, and then look at their root causes, which are what was going on, these different things. So anyway, we have one last question, unfortunately. We're out of time, actually, but just one last question right here.
Is there any reason we have to leave?
I think that we don't have the room.
Okay.
I just want to make one observation. I do thank you, Mr. Prostein, for some of your comments about the book, but for those of you who haven't read it, and I suspect that's most of you, I just wanted to say that this is Mercatus Center, so we're going to talk about regulation. There's a lot of stuff in the book that doesn't have anything to do with regulation that we find very interesting as well. But I just wanted my one comment about what Mr. Prostein said. You're absolutely right. We didn't talk about the financial crisis, but that has to do with housing and mortgages. And we make perfectly clear, I think, in the book that it was not intended to talk about housing and mortgages, if only because there are thousands of other books on that same topic. I appreciate that.
I just respond to you. There was a generalized credit bubble, and there was a bubble in all sorts of credit.
As you know, there were absolutely no defaults of any kind on automobile or credit card ABS although Gregory unfortunately has had to leave, and he was the expert on this thing. But the credit crisis was not in the consumer credit area, and that's the point I'm making. That's why we decided not to talk about it in the book. We decided not to talk about the credit crisis, we decided not to talk about mortgage credit. And so therefore, by default, along with it goes the credit crisis that arose in the mortgage credit area.
By the way, this is Tom Durkin. I think Tom introduced himself. Yeah, we don't talk about mortgages. It partly, mortgage would be probably another 600-page book. So, but
Oh, I do have a companion book on Truth in Lending Act. If you'd like to.
You have a whole chapter on the truth in lending.
I know we have another whole book.
Okay.
The last question.
I think I can speak loud enough. Just as a brief aside, when I first picked up the credit card, my mother gave me the same speech that y'all indicated that, the scare tactic of, don't overborrow all that. And my honest reaction was, Mother, every single TV sitcom in the 1990s had one episode, without fail, where the young teenage protagonist said, "Oh, credit card is free money," and he buys everything, buys a pinball table for the living room, and then he has to sob as they're all taking it away. Now, of course, that's comparably small fries, but I am curious. My question is, how, if at all, does culture play into the, let's call it a tonal shift of perspectives, of consumer perspectives on credit? Does that play into the behavioral economics equation? Like, say, if the experiments that Commissioner Wright was discussing, would they come out differently if say 20 years ago in a different time are there any other cultural effects that play into this if you explore it at all?
Social norms are really important. They're more important than regulation. In fact, we would rather rely on social norms than regulation because, it's a little more democratic, a little more flexible, doesn't have some of the downsides of regulation. The problem comes when social norms aren't strong enough, like in discrimination. I'm not sure they're not fine in the area of credit. I think social norms, as you point out with your mother and the TV shows and everything, that's fine for most things that aren't abusive. I don't think we need a CFPB to restrain us from taking out too much credit. But social norms are culture feeds into social norms along with a lot of other things, and I think that's really that ought to be the story when we talk about, especially in the consumer area, thinking about behavior and how to change behavior. The problem with social norms is they're real hard to change, and there's no textbook for how to change social norms.
I'll just say a few things. The first is, one point I wanted to stress is that as long as we've had consumer credit, we've had consumers who've misused credit, right? And consumers can misuse any product. As we saw, during the financial crisis, a heck of a lot of people misused good old-fashioned 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, right? I mean, in the end, the majority of defaults were on good old-fashioned 30-year fixed-rate mortgages for all kinds of reasons. But people are borrowing too much on those also. So people can always misuse credit. People always have misused credit. I think the argument we take away from the book is that it's not obvious that people are misusing credit more today than they were in the good old days, at least in the light. Second thing is social norms clearly matter, and they matter and generally also matter in specifics. So in the chapter on bankruptcy, for instance, which I was going to address, and Stephen raised some of it, it's hard to measure impact of social norms, but most people think that the social norms regarding filing bankruptcy are different now than they were in the past. And that impacts people's willingness to file bankruptcy, and that impacts people's willingness to take on debt and be willing to file bankruptcy, and that has all kind of implications. So I think that's a good example of a way, as Stephen was just suggesting, that social norms have an impact on people's behavior, both with respect to bankruptcy, but also how they manage their finances prior to that. And I think it's really hard to measure, though, and we don't have good measures of that.
And one of the strongest points in the book, and maybe your chapter, Todd, was when he pointed out that maybe one of the reasons that the norms against bankruptcy have changed is that when you used to go bankrupt, you wound up stiffing people you knew,
Yeah,
like my dad,
right.
as opposed to, Visa, MasterCard, which, some big company somewhere, and that may have something to do with the changing norm. So norms change for all these sort of weird and unpredictable, ways, and like the changing structure of the credit industry changed the norm, and I don't know whether anyone could have predicted or would have predicted that.
I'm going to turn over to Pete, but I want to thank Stephen and I want to thank Josh for their comments, and thank Mercatus and the PPE program for hosting this. So thank you, Pete.
Well, you just said what I was going to say, but I also want to thank my colleagues at Mercatus, Claire Morgan and
Yes.
Justin Hayes, and everyone else that was involved in making sure that the organization went the way it did, and I want to thank Todd and Steve and Josh and Abstention, and also Todd's fellow co-authors on this for a good discussion, and we'll continue to have these discussions. So everyone have a good holidays, and we'll see everyone in the Happy New Year. So thank you.